My name is Kalpa Vithalani, and I'm a licensing manager at the Medical College of Wisconsin in Milwaukee. I'm also a proud BioForward board member, second time, and I'm secretary. So it is my pleasure to welcome all of you, our sponsors, as well as our esteemed panelists. Rachel Roller from Aurora, Brian O'Connor from AdvaMed, and Patrick Plues from Bio. Before they get started on their panel, I do want to say, how many of you agree or ask by a show of hands, do you think of yourselves as a Wisconsin native and business person or entrepreneur, researcher, investor as coming from the Rust Belt? If you don't, raise your hand. Thank you. Do you think of yourself as flyover territory? If you don't, please raise your hand. So, by the talk we just heard from Charlie Alvarez, they clearly did not see us as the Rust Belt, nor did they see us as flyover territory, which is phenomenal. Another effort I want to tell you about in a real brief moment is an effort that we're leading in Southeast Wisconsin to bring the National Institutes of Health, SBIR and STTR conference to our state. We won it competitively. Last year it was in Orlando, the year before in Seattle. So it is in Milwaukee, November 7th, 8th, and 9th. There are flyers outside for all of you, and we encourage all of you to please attend this conference because, as we all know, seed funding is very difficult to come by these days, and this is non-dilutive funding from America's largest seed fund, $150,000 to over $1 million available for your biohealth companies. So with that, I will have our panelists please begin. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you all for having us here and listening to us. And Lisa promised us that we would not follow a dynamic and engaging panel, so we're really excited to be follow up at the Foxconn speech this morning. So thank you all for being here. Here to talk a little bit today about policy, kind of how that ties into healthcare, advancing healthcare, improving outcomes, saving and improving lives. And we'll each be talking about how we're trying to keep leaders in DC and state capitals out of that conversation as best we can. And so I want to kick it off with a little deeper introduction of each of our panelists, let them talk a little bit about who they are and who they work with. And since I'm serving as panelist and moderator, I'm going to give myself all the easy questions, so it's going to be fun up here. But Patrick, why don't we start with you talking about Bio?
Good morning. My name is Patrick Plues. I'm Vice President for State Government Affairs at Bio. And Bio is the national trade association based in Washington that represents the biotechnology industry. So our member companies are involved in every aspect of biotechnology, from biopharmaceuticals to agriculture to industrial applications of biotechnology. The bulk of our members are the biopharmaceutical community, and our members range from the very large multinational companies like Novartis, Amgen, J&J, to small startup biotechnology research-based companies around the world, actually. We like to say we heal, feed, and fuel the world at Bio.
Awesome. And Rachel, with Aurora?
Good morning. I'm thrilled to be here with all of you today. So my name is Rachel Roller. I serve as Senior Vice President of Community and Government Relations at Aurora Healthcare. And Aurora Healthcare is the largest provider in the state of Wisconsin. We're also in a bit of northern Illinois. Many of you may think of us as a hospital system. We do have 15 hospitals across eastern Wisconsin, but we're much more than that. We're an integrated healthcare delivery system with an employed physician group of about 1,800 providers. We provide about 2/3 of our care in the outpatient and home setting, and only 1/3 in the hospital setting. And another important point about Aurora is that we're highly engaged in research and innovation. We have over 500 research projects going on right now and hundreds of clinical trials. So our interests in policy are very diverse.
Excellent. And I work for a group called AdvaMed, the Advanced Medical Technology Association. And so we represent kind of anything med tech related to the healthcare system, be that knee replacement, heart valve, hospital beds. Hopefully as cool as the ones in the video from earlier, but right now not all the way there. But we literally are dedicated to bringing innovation to patient care each and every day. And so what we try to do is not only make a patient's experience in the hospital as brief or as short as we can imagine, but also get them back into the workplace as quickly as possible. This is our positive impact on the economy. So we kind of have two kind of angles that we chase on that. One is getting people back to work, as I mentioned, but also the difference between us and kind of some other of the healthcare spaces, we're a uniquely manufacturing-based industry. Medical technology companies are developing actual products that are developed mostly here in the States. And so we're trying to highlight that element and go from there. So today's theme is talking about kind of the future of healthcare, kind of where we are, where we're going to be. And we heard that Rachel, last time she was up on this stage, laid out a prediction slide following up on last year's election that kind of charted the course of where we think healthcare will be. I don't know if you've paid attention to DC, but predictions aren't really something we're doing very well right now. So I want to follow up with Rachel, talk about where we thought we would be last time we were together, and kind of to give an overlay of where we are right now.
Sure, thanks. So it's been a busy 9 months since I last saw many of you. Yeah. If you recall, I predicted that through the reconciliation method, the Congress would be moving forward a repeal replace piece of legislation. I had no idea that they'd try that 5 times, but they did. The last effort that failed just a few days ago, I believe is probably the last effort that we're going to see for a little bit of time. But I do think that this focus on repealing and replacing the ACA is going to continue. There is only so much time that the Senate in particular can work on issues, and they have quite a few issues they want to tackle, tax reform being on the top of the list. They also have executive appointments that are piling up right now. So their focus is on those issues, but we have to think forward. We have to think to open enrollment. And there are going to probably be some changes in terms of premiums, and people aren't going to be very happy when they are selecting their new plan options and saying that their costs are going to continue to balloon. So that could have some added pressure on Congress as well as the White House to revisit this issue of repeal replace. So I recommend that we all kind of brace for a next iteration. Whether that be a full-on repeal replace effort like we've seen in the past 9 months, who knows? Right now there's a lot of bipartisan work that's being led by Senator Murray and Alexander on the HELP Committee to at least look at short-term solutions to stabilize the marketplace. So there's still activity, even though there's been a lot of speculation that this issue is going to go away for some time. But I think we all need to be prepared for some changes going forward.
And Patrick, kind of following up on that, with all the efforts around repeal and replace this year, it seems like nothing is getting done in Washington, but it keeps people like us very busy because there's a lot of almost things that happen. And so from the bio perspective, moving away from the repeal and replace of ACA, what are some of the federal issues or top tier issues that you're all monitoring at bio?
Sure. I think one of the biggest things that we dealt with this year was the PDUFA reauthorization, which for our industry and for some of you that are in the biotech and biopharmaceutical space, that's probably the holy grail of legislation that we deal with every 8 years, and it's our user-free reauthorization with the FDA. That actually is, unlike everything else in Washington, it's a pretty collaborative process where we sit down with FDA, our partner organization, Pharma, and congressional leaders, both Republican and Democrat, to hash out a reauthorization bill that governs how the FDA approves our products. And there are always attempts to add other things onto that legislation that we don't necessarily agree with in terms of pricing, other types of legislation that we may not agree with, and it becomes a Christmas tree sort of piece of legislation. But this year it was a clean bill. We were very supportive of it. It adds a lot more patient engagement to the drug approval process, which is very important to some of our member companies because a lot of our member companies are in the very small specialized space and in developing products for very small patient populations. And it was important for us to convey to the FDA that they need to consider increased patient engagement and what the patient feels would be the best course of treatment or how that medication would work. And We were very successful in getting the FDA to agree to that in the FDAR FDA Reauthorization Act that just passed. So that was a pretty good shining example of when the process works for us.
Awesome. And Rachel, you mentioned open enrollment. Are there any other top line federal issues that are keeping you up at night?
Yes.
I figured there might be.
Yeah, I think that there are a couple of wild cards that are somewhat tied to the ACA efforts on repeal or replace that we need to be mindful of. One is the authority of the president to make an executive order, and we're anticipating in the next few days that he may be coming out with an order requiring his administration to look at ways to weaken the individual marketplace. You've already seen that there have been some changes. Our open enrollment period for the individual marketplace is much shorter than it ever has been before. The administration cut funding for advertising and navigator funding for the marketplace by 90%. So that's going to have a huge impact in terms of helping guide people to selecting their options on the individual marketplace. But this executive order business could be very important in terms of its impact on the individual marketplace, because what we're anticipating is that the president's going to look to his administration to allow for associations and community groups to band together to provide insurance options outside of the individual marketplace. So these will be competing plans, and we're concerned that that might lead to adverse selection and even more sicker and older individuals on the marketplace driving up premiums for those who purchase plans through the marketplace than the younger and healthier individuals buying plans and health coverage through other means. In addition to that, I would say another big wild card is changes that might be coming to our Medicaid programs across the country through the Medicaid waiver process. Our own state in Wisconsin has submitted a request to CMS to make changes to eligibility for childless adults that currently have coverage through Medicaid, and requiring job and working requirements, premiums responsibility, as well as drug testing for individuals from 0 to 100% of the federal poverty level. So these are all issues that keep me up at night because they impact coverage and access in our state.
And I think both of the panelists, talked about issues relating to access, coverage, improving patient care. And one of the issues that we're working to work on in DC is it does neither of those things, and it's called the medical device tax. And this came out of the Affordable Care Act, the Obamacare, but this has nothing to do with expanding coverage. This is a 2.3 excise tax on medical device manufacturers that is purely a budget method, purely a way to pay off the federal budget. So this is obviously an important issue here in Wisconsin, as Lisa mentioned in her opening remarks about the manufacturing effort, the medical technology manufacturing. Thank you for that shout out, Lisa, by the way. This is a huge issue here, and your leadership in DC has actually taken some initiatives here. Representative Ron Kine has been a champion on this issue from day one. He's currently rounding members on the Hill to sign a sign-on letter to show support for this issue, because this bill, we have a standalone bill introduced in the House last year that has over 260 co-sponsors on it. There's nothing else on Capitol Hill that's getting 260 votes on anything right now, and yet we still can't get this thing across the finish line. Just shows a bit of the dysfunction there. And I think some of our member companies might be in the room. I want to apologize for the emails I've sent you asking you to call all your members about 800 times a day. I do apologize. But another thing Rachel mentioned was focus on tax reform. We are literally trying to attach this bill to anything that comes down the pipe the rest of this year. Tax reform, tax extenders, S-CHIP, which is reauthorizing children's health plans. No one wants to be attached to that, but this is just kind of where we are right now in DC, where so little is getting done that the fear of executive order coming in and completely changing the game without congressional approval is a frightening reality. So since DC is so scary, we go to a very safe space, state capitals across the country, where nothing crazy goes on ever. And so one certainty we know from the lack of the success of ACA is more and more decisions are going to fall to the state, whether they like it or not. You hinted at some of the Medicaid changes, some waivers, things of that nature. And actually, I guess we'll start with you then if you want to expand on that a little more further. But a little more further. I did that out loud. So just, are the states equipped to handle this? These are huge issues, huge budgetary issues, and issues that are important to patients' lives. Are the states positioned to handle this, and what issues in particular are you all working on to ensure that they potentially are?
Mm-hmm. So I think it cuts two ways. One is the question of, can they do this with the funding that's needed, right, to adequately administer the program of Medicaid? And that was probably one of the most controversial aspects of the repeal, replace legislative efforts over the last 9 months, was this issue of Medicaid, and do you block grant Medicaid, and at what level? And you've got states like ours that didn't take the Medicaid expansion funding, and then you have other states that did take Medicaid expansion dollars. So this issue of equity is ongoing, and it hasn't been resolved. And I think that's probably one of the biggest impediments that's really been a barrier to comprehensive reform at the federal level. So if our state was adequately funded, I think that there are a number of really innovative solutions that we could bring forth without having to deal with the regulatory barriers that we currently face with CMS, needing to approve waivers and going through that regulatory process at the federal level. I do think that regulatory relief would allow a lot of us to come forward with some really innovative solutions, whether they be digital or genomic or population health management. I think we're all craving to be able to play in that space, both in the commercial market, the Medicare space, as well as Medicaid. So I do think that there's opportunity if it's designed correctly and if the right players are at the table to help our state innovate within the Medicaid program.
Some of those barriers you mentioned, Patrick, let's throw it to you next, and there's some specific policies that Bio or you might be pursuing to improve access, and while I think that every public official in state capitals has the right intentions at heart, sometimes there are some challenges there. So I wonder if you could walk through some of the things that you're looking at that differentiate from the federal and the state level.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the states are where things are happening, and I can't agree more with Rachel. If you are interested in how the government's going to change healthcare policy, really pay attention to the Medicaid waiver process right now, because you have an administration that is opening up and is becoming more amenable to allowing states to govern their own Medicaid programs. So there are, I think I wrote in my notes, right now there's 33 states that are operating under a Medicaid waiver, and there are 18 states now that have Medicaid waivers in front of CMS to get approval, and they vary in all shapes and sizes. To Rachel's point, there are some that require workforce, that have workforce requirements. There was one that was recently submitted by Governor Baker in Massachusetts that may institute a closed drug formulary in Medicaid, which is something that we're concerned with because our members pay a Medicaid rebate of 23.3% to participate in this program, and with the understanding that Medicaid patients will have access to these products. And this waiver kind of plays a little bit around with that access issue, and it's concerning to us, but it's just an example of how states are trying to get innovative to bring costs under control. So I would pay very close attention to those waivers, and the Kaiser Foundation has, it's a very good resource for you all if you want to see what's out there. They do surveys on these Medicaid waivers, and it's pretty informative information and valuable information. But to Brian's point, one of the big issues that we're working on in the states is obviously dealing with the whole issue of drug pricing. We are seeing a number of states introduce legislation requiring price transparency for our manufacturers. Part of the problem with that is the way these bills are written, they are not really going to bring down cost for prescription drugs. I think they're an attempt to shame manufacturers, but at the end of the day, they're not going to do much to bring down the cost of a prescription drug. I mean, and it's requiring manufacturers to provide the state and ultimately the public data points that they're not going to understand or to make a decision. And we saw this. Vermont passed the first bill last year, and they tried to implement it. And when it required, the state was going to come out. The state Medicaid program was going to come out with a list of the top 10 or 15 most expensive biopharmaceutical products that cause the state Medicaid program to spend more than they want to. And then they go after those manufacturers and ask those manufacturers to provide certain cost input data points to the state so the state can determine what's the cost drivers, and they couldn't determine it. So I think that type of legislation and that type of policy sounds good on paper, but in reality it doesn't work. One of the things that we're working on, and we've got a bill right now in Wisconsin that we think will bring down prescription drug costs, is legislation that would require the substitution of biologic medicines in the retail pharmacy. We call it our biosimilars bill. As part of the ACA, when it was enacted in 2009, there was a provision in there that gave the FDA authority to approve and regulate biosimilar products, which are lower cost versions of brand name biologic products. Every state now has to pass legislation to allow those products to be substituted at the pharmacy. So we have a bill right now that we will be getting ready to introduce in the Wisconsin legislature that will allow pharmacists in Wisconsin to substitute those lower cost biologics to patients, which will be something that will really bring down drug costs in the state. And it's something that we're pushing as an alternative to some of these pricing bills, that it actually will do something to impact a patient's cost for biologic medicines.
Awesome, thank you. And so a common theme among the panelists and generally we discussed today is an ongoing effort, to positively affect the healthcare system by reducing cost, increasing the quality of care, and improving patient outcomes, which all sounds pretty simple. And I think we can just say we did it, right? No, we haven't done it yet. But Rachel, Aurora has done some pretty cool, innovative thinking around this, and I want to open the floor with you to talk about just some of those efforts and some of the ones that you think really will positively bend the cost curve and improve patients' lives.
Sure. Thanks for that opportunity. So I think keeping on with the theme of Medicaid reform, one thing that we've done is really focused in on patient need, and patient need beyond just medical health care. So often the patients that are coming through our emergency department that have no clear understanding of how to utilize healthcare and may not have a lot of experience in having health coverage previously are coming to our emergency departments, and they're seeking care for a common cold or a primary care checkup, and the most expensive healthcare setting that we can think of. So one thing that we've instituted is a program where we've embedded social workers in a few of our hospitals that see significant traffic of patients coming for urgent care or primary care needs. And we provide care for them beyond that medical unit of care. So we're providing social determinant welfare. We're making sure that they have access to housing, to utilities, to food, and if they have violence in their home, helping them, seek out services and lift them up. At the same time, we're also serving as an advocate for these patients. So we have about a year and a half worth of data that has been demonstrating the success of this model, that if you really meet the patients where they're at, where they're coming for care, you can empower them to be their own advocate. And we've seen about a $3 million reduction in Medicaid utilization spend and a reduction in utilization of the emergency department by nearly 60%. With these types of investments. None of that is covered by the Medicaid program today. So this is one of those great opportunities for our state, if it's allowed, to innovate and again, meet the patient's needs that may extend well beyond healthcare.
Rachel, one of the things Rachel said about meeting the patient where they are, bringing healthcare to the patient. So you mentioned during the FDA reauthorization the increased effort in patient-focused drug development. Mm-hmm. It seems like a bit of a novel idea, but within the regulatory and reimbursement systems, involving the patient in the development process is kind of new, unfortunately. I don't know if you could expand on that a little bit about why it's important for biotech companies to involve the patient in the development process.
Yeah, because I think I touched briefly on it, but a lot of our companies are involved in this special space, especially drug space, where you're dealing with small patient populations. So it is incumbent upon them to pay close attention to the patients that these products are ultimately going to benefit. And we went through I would say a 2-year process where we have a and it's so important to our members that we had a board level, CEO level committee that did nothing but sit down and listen to patient concerns and patient input on the way clinical trials are set up. Not only the way trials are set up, but how often and how easy or how difficult is it to take a regimen of medicine? Is it best to have a once a day injection versus a twice a day, a twice weekly infusion at an infusion center? Those types of questions, and it was a very long iterative process that I think benefited not only the patient community but our members as manufacturers, and the quality was so good that the FDA actually adopted it without much pushback from the agency. And the FDA is the gold standard around the world for drug development approval. So.
And on the FDA, we're good at doing some DC bashing. The two guys from DC who come in to tell you, like, don't worry, it's fine. No, it's not. But there are some positive elements happening right now in the approval space. And particularly, I just want to follow when you messaged with FDA. Kind of the medical technology companies have seen just great advancement in the transparency or just the predictability of the regulatory process within DC. But we haven't seen that so much is on the CMS side, the coverage side. So much of medical technology's payment adoption by private payers is predicated on CMS giving them a code, basically guaranteeing them some level of reimbursement. And so that just has not kept up with the FDA improvements. So one of the areas where we're focusing on that, reducing costs, improving outcomes, is really working with CMS to highlight the value of our products. And that's on two sides. One, with device products themselves, and with diagnostics. And diagnostics is really exciting venture for healthcare at all. It gets back to the early diagnosis, accurate diagnosis, and what that means for the regimen of treatment and the positive outcome that can have on a patient. So we're focused on that as a way to really engage with the patient population, because getting their feedback to CMS helps urge that reimbursement code. This thing is worth it. The heart valve that I had 10 years ago is not as good as the one I had now, and maybe we should have a little slightly higher reimbursement level for it, which makes it all sound about funding, but that funding is necessary for the research and development into the next round of a breakthrough product. Another way that we're trying to engage in this, reducing this cost curve, is the incorporation of big data. We heard a little bit about it earlier, but it goes back to the diagnoses, just more information. AdvaMed just launched AdvaMed Digital, a whole new sector earlier this year. And it's going beyond Fitbits. It's going beyond in vitro diagnostics, in vivo diagnostics, things that are letting people know that they are in trouble before their doctors even realize it. This actually ties back to a state policy issue that we got wrapped up in a little bit this year about connected devices, so the Internet of Things, right? And I think right now the number they say is there's 21 billion, 12 billion devices attached to the Internet of Things, and how can we harness that data to utilize it for healthcare? So some of those Internet of Things include like children's teddy bears that are transmitting data to marketers and things of that nature, and legislators intending to stop that from happening were involving med tech companies. Patients transmitting their blood glucose levels to doctors for diabetes care, ensuring that they're fast, responsive care. If we are utilizing the data correctly, it really does get to Rachel's point of bringing down the cost curve at a whole. I mean, the savings you outlined for involving the patient are mind-boggling for states across the country, and so hopefully we'll get there. But so kind of building on that, the overall goal is bending the cost curve, getting it all down. So Rachel, I want to start with you on kind of our final big picture question. As we talked about some good ideas here and some hopeful hints, where's this all going? Where do you see us in the next 25, 50 years or so? And have we fixed this thing?
I think we should get Charlie back on the stage, because I think Foxconn has provided us a fascinating prediction of what healthcare is going to look like in 25 years. Well, the way that they're talking, it might be next year. But,
Seriously.
but in terms of the future of healthcare, I'm very hopeful that it will continue to trend to allow for the innovation that you're all leading, that will have continued consumerism, innovation, telehealth, digital health, genomics, big data, predictive modeling. I mean, all of that, it should be the emphasis right now. We want to get to a state where we're moving away from this fee-for-service system that was referred to earlier, and where we're incentivized for keeping people well. And if we can get there from a policy perspective, I think that the opportunities are endless in terms of transforming the health and well-being of our communities. And so that's what we're working on in a more macro level out in DC right now. But at the same time, we're fighting this continued fight over coverage and access. So I'm really hopeful that we can resolve that topic and that people get the access and coverage that they need, and we can continue to focus on prevention and wellness as a country.
Awesome. Patrick?
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things now that some of our member companies are looking at, and we're doing this in collaboration with payers, is value-based purchasing. And we're ready to put our money where our mouth is to say that our products do provide value to the system overall, but what does that look like? So I think right now there's a discussion of how do we define value. Certain people define value differently, but at least we have some of our larger members too that are looking at making this work and working with specific health plans across the country to help pay for the value of our medicines. But I think that's probably the biggest thing we're working on in terms of trying to bend the cost curve from the biopharmaceutical perspective.
Well, and kind of tying all that together, and you all here is, really kind of hopefully where we are in 25 to 50 years is all in the same room together talking about these solutions. Biotech companies talking to payers, healthcare systems, talking to patients, our phones talking to our hospital beds, and vice versa, because no one is going to solve the cost curve problem on their own. Insurers in a silo. Drug makers in a silo, med tech in a silo, healthcare system in a silo. And so hopefully in the next 25 to 50 years, we're replicating more events like this, quite frankly, and giving props to the attendees here and Lisa for pulling this group together. I mean, because the healthcare ecosystem for too long has kind of been segmented in their own area over here and been competitive. And our speaker before, mentioned the need to share that data and what that can unlock. And so hopefully we get there. But that's kind of the hope here. So that's the end of our formal question portion of today, and we're very scaredly going to open it up to the audience now. Just kidding, we're not going to that. But there are some mics out there, I believe, and if anyone has any questions for our panelists, compliments for the moderator, either one. Uh-oh.
Yes.
I see one over there and one there.
Thanks for everyone's comments.
Good.
I have a quick question, if everyone can hear me, at least you could repeat it. How does a local organization like Aurora, obviously you're very large and prevalent here in the state, but work with kind of the organizations that you're sharing the panel with? They are UC based, they have companies like mine from across the United States that are members. Do you guys partner in any ways? It seems like the system's really innovative, like you mentioned.
We do, yes. And in fact, we have representatives in the audience. You should be raising your hands from Aurora Healthcare. Dr. Randy Lambrecht and Mike Rogers are here. So we're a member of BioForward and very proud member of BioForward and are looking for ways to collaborate. So to be honest, I don't know if we're a member of your organization. Sorry.
Not yet.
Okay, so we're going to talk after this. But we're very open to having collaborative conversations about how we can partner together. So I would recommend that we connect.
And then not to speak for Patrick, Patrick and I both in our roles, we actually work with the BioForwards across the entire country. So like THBI in Texas, Medical Alley in Minnesota, California, et cetera. And so a lot of the times we are looking through those local associations to find best practice stories, find what's working and use it as an example to highlight to other states across the country, quite frankly. And usually it's policy focused. We'll see if how Aurora has partnered, with the state, on a key issue and try to replicate that elsewhere. Because, a lot of times in development of biotech, that's only in Boston, it's only in San Francisco. Med tech, it's only in the Midwest. And, if you have the right infrastructure, you can do this anywhere. And so to those efforts, if we're not partnering directly, we're leaning on like BioForward to highlight these cool examples and hopefully translate them back up to policymakers.
Yeah, and this is not a plug for Lisa, but she is one of our stronger associate members, and we highlighted her organization to a lot of our affiliates around the country of this is the right thing to do, especially she's helped us tremendously in the legislative advocacy front, and we highlight her a lot as a best practice.
Yeah, as far as changing the pictures, she's been trying to do that for a while behind the scenes. So,
So you belong to a very good organization, a very good organization.
I think we had a question.
I think, yeah.
Oh, in the back.
The woman, yep.
I actually have the mic, sorry.
Oh,
So I'll send it your way next.
Nice.
From your perspective, how does research fit into everything that you guys are working on from a U.S. healthcare perspective, working with the legislatures?
our industry lives and dies by research. I mean, we're the research-based arm of the biopharmaceutical industry. I think how we work with governments, some of our smaller companies do get some funding from the federal government to initiate some research programs. But one of the misconceptions that I'd like to dispel is we always hear this from legislators that the government pays for research that we ultimately profit from. That's not exactly true. The NIH is very, very good and very strong at the basic research, but our companies have to invest in a lot of money in taking that idea and bringing it to the patient. And that's something that is mostly a private company enterprise or undertaking, which is a significant portion of the funding that our companies are involved in. But research is the cornerstone for us, and we do collaborate with the government on that.
Like I mentioned earlier, we have a very robust research entity within Aurora Healthcare. It receives NIH funding and Department of Defense funding. So highly engaged in issues that impact those funding streams. In addition to that, the research findings really help me in advocating for our organization and validating the work that we're doing and why we need to transform healthcare. So without research, without innovation, and the results that come from that work, I'd be somewhat inept. So it's critical to the work that I do every day.
I think that's an important point on the advocacy side for how it ties into research, is because when we're talking to legislators, a lot of times you're telling a story. Mm-hmm. You're painting a picture of what's next in healthcare, quite frankly. And so a lot of times highlighting cutting edge research, bringing in researchers to talk about what they're doing with the passion they're doing is a lot more effective than me coming in and doing my spiel.
Is it my turn? Great, thanks. It's been a wonderful panel. Thank you so much. So I was just curious. My name is Erica Long from Mallinckrodt Pharmaceuticals. One of the big things that we keep hearing about, both on a state and national level, is the opioid crisis. And I would love to know how both of your organizations and your company is treating consumers and patients that are affected by the opioid crisis, and sort of the research and development that all of our companies are trying to achieve in that space, both as alternatives to opioids and treatment for addiction to opioids. And I'd love to hear your thoughts.
So from a provider perspective, we're the largest behavioral health and mental health provider in the state of Wisconsin. So we are absolutely on the front lines and are seeing how this epidemic is growing day by day. We recently invested an additional $35 million into expanding our aorta treatment facilities throughout eastern Wisconsin, and we still have a 6-month waiting period. Even with the expansion. And when I say expansion, both inpatient and outpatient. So we have a very significant inpatient presence in Wisconsin as well as outpatient presence. We have a partial hospitalization program, which we found to be incredibly successful because it allows our patients to continue to live in their homes and their communities, but receive intensive therapy. So the success rate, it has been phenomenal. But we're not seeing that being replicated throughout the provider community. And one of the reasons for that is the federal government has recently reduced funding for provider reimbursement for partial hospitalization services. So in terms of advocacy, that's something that we're definitely sharing with the congressional delegation and with the committees that have jurisdiction over the issues of facing this opioid epidemic. So we're very mindful of it, and I'd love to hear more, perhaps after our session today, about the work that you're doing and that effort.
Yeah, and this is a national challenge. I think this started people thought it was in pockets and rural pockets, and this is everywhere across the country. And so some of our companies, currently have devices on the market, as alternatives to opioids for pain management, be like, spinal stimulation, neurostimulation, or time release devices, that every few hours release a certain amount of pain management medication into the patient. However, one of the problems with that is, a patient is in pain, a patient is in need, and they go to the pharmacy or their doctor, and its prescription is much faster than that, and the reimbursement rates are different as well. They're much higher, obviously, for a full device implant. So we're working right now with actually a lot of state capitals across the country to try to find a way to close that gap and ensure that there is an alternative there to the opioids themselves.
I think from Bio's perspective, we actually have put together a huge working group on this to kind of see where we can play to alleviate or mitigate this crisis as well. And we have a number of companies, especially in the biologic side, that are looking at opioid or non-opioid alternatives to pain management and to pain care. And then we're working with the FDA to see if we can get those through the regulatory process in a more efficient manner. And the other aspect of it is working with the reimbursement community to make sure that abuse deterrent formulations are on equal footing or actually on preferred footing as well. So I think everybody recognizes probably the number one problem right now that we're facing, but it's very interesting to see the technology that's going into looking at other alternatives in treating pain. But I also don't want people to lose sight that we don't want to give people that actually have this need to manage their pain, we don't want to leave them without options. So I think these other non-opioid types of medications are going to be interesting and probably important tools in the tool chest to fight pain.
Hi, my name's Wally Block. I'm at the Biomedical Engineering Department at UW in Medical Physics. I run into a lot of companies and medical devices who want to add value by connecting with our electronic health records and moving into machine learning. What states and providers are leading in finding ways to give medical device companies access to those records and then providing them a way to be able to protect their algorithms to get value for that effort?
No, it's an excellent question, and it varies greatly by state. It will not surprise you to see some of the ones on the cutting edge, are California. So some of the more kind of progressive legislative states. Anthem has partnered with a few of our companies on this. Kaiser, of course, is always a leader, I feel like, across the board. But I can actually follow up specifically with specific examples from our digital health team because state adoption is a huge thing for us because if that part doesn't come together, no one's going to invest in the field. So I'll follow up one-on-one on that.
Charlie mentioned that Taiwan has a single-payer healthcare system, which is also true in many parts of the world, as I think you know. There's speculation that Obamacare was designed to fail as a segue into single-payer. State of California is considering single-payer. So where's single-payer going in California or any place else in this country?
Well, the single-payer bill in California was passed in the Senate, and the entire Senate clapped themselves in the back saying we passed single-payer health care, and they shunted it over to the Assembly to figure out how to pay for it, and that's where it died. I think there has been some analysis on the California bill that it would have been a $400 billion price tag to the state, which scared a lot of members of the Assembly. So I think the Speaker right now in California has put together a task force to look at how they can pay for something like a single-payer bill in California. And I do think if you have a state like the size of California that everybody sort of sees as the example for other states to follow, that if this does take traction in California, you may see other states looking at it. I know New York also has a single-payer bill that was introduced last session that we'll probably see some activity on in 2018. So it's something that the progressive side of the Democratic Party has embraced and is pushing. So I don't think it's going to go away, but I do think there are some cost challenges when people sit down and actually try and figure out how much this is going to cost that'll put the brakes on it. Vermont tried this, I want to say, 4 or 5 years ago. They passed a single-payer bill, and they could not implement it because it would have required a 40% tax increase on the residents, and they didn't want to take it. So we've got to get to a point in this country where people are willing to pay for it. before it becomes a reality.
Rachel, you have thoughts on Medicare for All?
I thought that was a phenomenal summary. The only thing I'd add is, you've got Senator Bernie Sanders, who still is propping up this concept of a Medicare for all alternative to the repeal replace debate. So I wouldn't be surprised if at the national level you'll see that continue to be a platform for the more progressive side of the Democratic Party.
Yeah, it's definitely gotten more traction than it has before. So.
Okay. Recently, Amazon just announced that they want to sell pharmaceuticals in Amazon. So is it possible to reduce the pharmaceutical cost to patient? So if yes, is any impact for insurance system? If not, does Amazon is another kind of channel like CVS or Walgreens? Yeah.
I'm sorry, can you repeat your question? Yeah.
Recently, the Amazon announcement that they want to sell sell drugs in Amazon. And it's possible to reduce the pharmaceutical cost to patient. I'm not sure, because when Amazon merged Whole Food, they reduce the cost of the food. Yeah. So if Amazon reduce the cost, will impact any insurance system. So, or if not, if Amazon is like another channel, like a CVS or Walgreens. How do you think about it?
I mean, the devil in that's in the details. They just announced it. We'd like to see what their plans are for getting into drug distribution, but they are huge, and I think the Amazon deal has a lot of the PBMs, Express Scripts, CVS Caremark, scared because of just the sheer size and network of Amazon. But I think once we know a little bit more about the details of what they're planning, we'll see how it impacts drug costs. But if you do have an entity that large that serves as the middleman or the purchaser for prescription drugs, they will have an impact on price.
But still the big way to get the price down is kind of the value-based arrangements we discussed and found some research of some of the major health systems. I mean, the size is going to help, but it's still going to take some fundamental change on the reimbursement side to that replacing the fee-for-service value. I mean, that's one of the big ones.
During your talk, you mentioned something about reducing costs by taking away incentives to treat patients more, like to fee-for-service. I was wondering, what kind of things do you think we could do to change these perverse incentives and turn them around so that we want less patients rather than more in hospitals?
So currently, to your point, the fee-for-service model reimburses us based on volume, right? So there's a punitive incentive for us to have patients in our hospitals with lengths of stay, and what we'd love to see is reimbursement based on population health management. So what are we doing in engaging the patient in their wellness and looking beyond true just medical care and looking at all those social determinant issues that I talked about earlier? I think that if we were reimbursed for that level of care and rewarded for keeping patients healthy and out of our hospitals, you would see a completely different paradigm of healthcare than we currently have today. So that's the vision that we're seeking as we're meeting with the Wisconsin congressional delegation, is how do we incorporate those changes and have a transition period so that because you can't possibly change the system from what it is today to that new state overnight. It's going to take some time, but I think the value-based purchasing metrics are ones that we should continue to invest in and promote, both in the commercial payer setting as well as in the government setting. So I would encourage more acceleration of that work.
And at AdvaMed, we're actually starting kind of that process internally more than externally on the value-based conversation. We've just launched a value framework that we're rolling out for our diagnostics and our device companies. And it's to keep our developers thinking of kind of 4 key areas when they're in the process. It's clinical impact, obviously, patient impact outside of that, patient preference, societal impact, and payer impact. You have to include that in your calculus. What is the current reimbursement rate, and how do you keep that in mind? And so hopefully keeping those 4 things in mind as we go forward, showing that our companies are taking initiative on that, thinking about value in terms of reimbursement, we'll hopefully bring some of the payers along with us.
Patrick, you mentioned the Biosimilar Act, enabling pharmacists to substitute biosimilars. To date, though, at least in the US, the innovator companies have been pretty successful using patent litigation to keep approved biosimilars from being marketed. Do you see that situation changing?
Good question. I mean, I think if I'm a brand name manufacturer, I'm going to do everything I can to protect my patents. So, I mean, I think you're always going to see this struggle between the innovative company and the biosimilar company defending their patent. They have every right to defend their patent. So, I don't know what the future of that holds, but you know, we are encouraged about the number of biosimilars applications that are in the FDA and the 3 products now that are on the market that hopefully will get interchangeability status. I don't think the biosimilar industry is going to shrink. I think it's going to just get bigger because it is it is still going to be a good business model for not only the generics industry, but the branded industry. You have a lot of branded companies that are now in the biosimilar space, which is interesting, and that's not as prevalent anymore on the generic side. But that's a good question, and you know, time will tell. But I don't see that segment of the industry shrinking. I see it growing.
Good questions, guys.
I want to ask one more question, if you don't mind. In terms of paying for our healthcare, we're talking about constantly improving access, reducing cost, increasing quality. It's hard to already pay for this, even in transitioning from this fee-for-service model to a more accountable care, population health management type, slightly risk-bearing approach. And yet we want to integrate more technology into our healthcare, as we just saw and we were discussing before the panel. Hey, if we're sick, we would like to be in one of those beds, right? Or in one of those hospitals. Who's going to pay for the technology and how?
Thank you all for coming. No,
Yeah.
I mean that is the question, and it gets back to the healthcare for all question. You know, the payment part is very real and something we can't avoid. And so, you know, one of the things that we talk about in some of the models for the healthcare system, some of the stuff for our diagnostic products, you know, is it's almost more of a challenge paying more cost up front for better cost long term. And so, you know, the same way we're trying to shift the reimbursement model to value-based is kind of thinking about how we pay about healthcare in general. You know, kind of paying more upfront to improve outcomes long term. Do I know the answer to that? It gets back to Patrick's point. You know, if there's going to be improved healthcare, someone does have to pay for it, and that the universal healthcare options will fall to taxpayers in certain levels. So it is going to take collaboration across the board. Hopefully, the incorporation of all the stuff we talked about today, that video becoming real life everywhere, brings the cost down, makes it more attainable. But that is an unfortunate reality right now, is how we get there.
Yeah, I mean, once again, the gentleman had a great question about single payer. I've been in the industry since the mid-'90s, and we've always gone through these waves of wringing our hands about healthcare for all, but you know, this wave of it seems more real, and I think there are large segments of the population that previously would run away from a healthcare for all system are now gravitating towards it. So it's gaining traction, and it's going to be very interesting to see if the government's going to be the payer of it, or if we're going to have a hybrid system, or how it's going to evolve. But it's like I said, the healthcare for all government plan is gaining some traction.
The only thing I would add is when you look at the trajectory of healthcare spend, at least within government entitlement programs, so Medicare and Medicaid, for instance, I mean, these programs are just enormous. Yeah. They're usurping every other social entitlement program that we have today. So if there's a way that we can drive innovation and technology that reduces that spend, that's going to impact all of us as taxpayers. So I would challenge everyone in this audience to think about that and think about the Medicare and Medicaid space in particular and how we can transform that, because I would love for this industry to come up with the solutions around reforming the Medicare and Medicaid spend issue rather than continuing to brace for whatever comes out of Congress or whatever comes from future bureaucrats. So I think that it's not a one-size-fits-all solution, and I think technology can drive a lot of the cost reduction that is so desperately needed to transform these programs. And if we're fortunate enough to have an administration, both at the federal level and at the state level, who are amenable enough to accept and test these models, we're taking steps in the right direction.
Yeah. And it was important you look at Medicaid and Medicare for all their sizes. They are sort of what the private market looks to follow by example. So that's what makes those programs so important, especially for our industries. The private sector usually follows the government on ideas on healthcare delivery.
With that, we will conclude this panel. We'd like to thank our panelists for such an excellent discussion. I'd like to invite all of you, thank you.
Okay.
And we'd like to invite everyone to join us in the foyer for lunch. And remember to sign up for the SBIR conference. Thank you.